Well, good morning, class. Today's Wednesday, April 29th. This is part A of lecture. We are making a transition into chapter 6, yearling stocker management decisions, and we'll stick with this chapter through the rest of the semester, which is only 1 week. So we're going to spend 1 week on stocker calves. We should be able to get it done by next week. Okay, there'll be 2 parts to today's lecture, part A and part B. Well, let's start with a chapter and let's look at some definitions and types of stocker operations. So what is the definition of a stocker operation? It's cattle that are fed and managed for growth prior to going to a feedlot for finishing. So we knew that. That's one of our segments of our industry. We're going to add that inexpensive weight gain. We're going to let them grow. We're going to let them mature. We're going to let their herd health get straightened out a little bit because they're going to come from all different kinds of commercial cow-calf operations. So we want to make sure they've been vaccinated, dewormed, and treated for flies. But most of the time they're going to be grazed on forage, but not always the case. Not always the case. So by definition, most stocker calves are going to be weaned steers and weaned heifer calves that are eventually headed for the feed yard. However, in times of plenty of rain and lots of good green grass, there's no reason why a person couldn't take some thin cull cows, some cows that were culled from a commercial cow-calf ranch, and they were thin. They might be on body condition score 3. There's no reason why someone couldn't take those cows and graze them for 3 to 6 months to add weight prior to taking them to be sold to a slaughter facility for the cull cow trade. So if you got some thin cows due to poor conditions in one part of the country, so let's say, for example, New Mexico had a drought and Texas was wet and had a lot of grass, there would be for sure some entrepreneurs buy those thin cows at a really low price and put some weight on them. And so as long as they had good teeth and as long as they were in, probably less than 10 years of age, you can make some money on them. In addition, stocker cattle can also be just a set of replacement heifers that you're growing out. So you can treat them exactly like stockers and put some weight on them inexpensively. But by and large, most time when we talk about stocker cattle, we're talking about recently weaned steers and recently weaned heifers that probably most likely went through some sort of an auction market, and they're going to be taken care of and get ready and put on grass for 6 months to a year. So the first thing we're going to look at in chapter 6 is figure 1. So here's figure 6.1 in chapter 6. And chapter 6 begins on page 162. So this is on the bottom of 162. Now I've modified it a little bit because this diagram is pretty much, or this figure is pretty much geared toward spring calving, commercial cow-calf ranches. That's what it's geared for. So we're talking about a majority of spring-born calves. So they would be weaned about September, October. That's when most auction barns are full of spring-born calves. So they're born in the spring and weaned in the early fall. And so I went ahead and put fall up here. So we got weaned steers and heifers. And really, once you wean those calves, they can go a couple different routes to the feed yard. In some instances, especially if we're selling beef to Japan, who likes to have those fed steers and fed heifers coming out of a feed yard at about 20 months of age because they're afraid of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. Oftentimes those feed yards in the Pacific Northwest part of our country will receive weaned steers and heifers directly from the ranch, and those will go directly to a feedlot or a feed yard, and then they'll stay there for upwards of almost, let's say 20 months. Or no, that's not true either. Probably, say if we wean them at 6 months and we want to market them at 20 months, so they'd stay there for 14 months. So they'd stay there for over a year. Whereas most slaughter steers and heifers only stay in a feed yard for about 200 days. So there's no reason why we can't go right to the feed lot with those calves, and that happens sometimes. So that's not what we're really talking about. What we're really talking about is this route when we talk about stocker calves. So for the most part, weaned steers and heifers are going to spend a winter in a backgrounding yard or custom lot, or they're going to be grazed. Okay, maybe on some dry forage and then put on winter wheat. So those calves coming off of those situations can also go directly to the feedlot, or like in South Texas, once we get them through that first winter, they can go to grass, like down at La Paloma Ranch just south of Kingsville on the highway between Rivera and Falfurrias. You can go by there starting about August 15th. They'll start taking in calves, and they're going to background them right there in the facility, and then they'll go to summer grazing, and then from summer grazing they'll go into the feedlot in the following fall. So honestly, folks, these steers are born in the spring, they're weaned in the fall, they get through their first winter, so they'll be a yearling, and then they go summer grazing, so they'll be 15-16 months of age before they go to a feedlot. And then once they're in a commercial feedlot or a custom feedlot, they're going to be considered slaughter fed steers and slaughter heifers, and they'll come out being fat steers and fat heifers. So this kind of gets us back to our original, gives us a chance to remember all the segments of the industry. So a wintering lot or a custom lot, I'm going to show you some pictures that may look like this. So you can see these cattle here. There is a feed bunk here. It's a small feed yard. There's our water trough right there that's got pipe around it so they can't get in it. And you can see these calves here. They're not recently weaned, but these calves right here are eating a forage-based diet, so they're eating hay in here. And so we're still trying to get cheap gain on these cattle. Most of this ration is not going to be grain, although there is some grain back here in the background. You can see that there on top is hay. So it's kind of a mixed diet of hay and a little bit of grain. I got some other pictures I want to show you to kind of give you an idea of maybe what a backgrounding lot or a wintering lot or a custom lot may look like, and it's going to be very different than a true feed lot or a feed yard. Okay? Now, the same thing happens with fall-born calves. It's just you replace this with spring. So fall-born calves are weaned in the spring, and then they stay with mama over the winter. So fall-born calves, remember, they're going to be a little bit lighter. They may not be wintered or go to a custom lot. They may go strictly to summer grazing, because we're going to wean those calves about April, May, about right now. So for us folks that have two calving season, it's a little bit different, but I just wanted to let you know that this figure is pretty much designed for commercial cow-calf ranches that have spring-born calves, and that's for most parts of the country north of Texas. Here's a pretty typical backgrounding yard or a wintering yard. You can see it's winter. There's not much green grass over here. Now these calves are getting a grain-based diet, but there might be several hay rolls out here, or there could be other pasture back in the background. And so these cattle are not strictly in a feedlot. They're on a wintering program or a backgrounding program, and so it's not quite as intense as a feed yard. And so what'll happen, and you can see these cattle are pretty uniform, so whoever bought these calves are looking for kind of a red cattle, maybe limousine-based cattle, and they're weaned calves. You can see some are bigger and some are smaller. And so what the option here is to get them ready for grass. And so you can get them straightened out. You can get them over, because they're going to have some sickness going through the marketing channel, and so you're going to have to make sure they're vaccinated. You're going to have to make sure they're treated for parasites, both internal and external. And so it just gives them 2 or 3 months to kind of get on feed, get used to going to water, and getting ready for grass. So that's kind of what a wintering or a backgrounding lot might look like in my mind. Here's another kind of low input backgrounding or wintering yard. This doesn't happen to be in the winter because you can see all the green grass back here, but notice it's not very fancy. It's functional. They got hay rings here. Here's a set of weaned calves. And so what this owner would do would come through here and check these calves every day and look for snotty nose, look for head down, and they may treat them with antibiotics or, kind of monitor their health and kind of get them straightened out, kind of get them used to being together. And these cattle may have come from 10 different ranches, and so that's kind of what happens in a wintering program or a backgrounding lot before they go out on grass. All right, very different. This is a true commercial feed yard or a true custom feed yard. Notice how different it looks. And so that's where the cattle will end up eventually after the stocker phase. Okay, so obviously a big feed mill here in the middle. Each one of these pens holds about 100 head of cattle. You can see here's their hospital pen. More than likely, they got a working chute here, and they can keep an eye on any sick cattle. But you got all different colors of cattle. This is, I believe this one's from Colorado, and you can see it's a little bit drier there. So we got sprinklers going to keep the dust down. So I just want you to get in your mind what a true feed yard looks like versus a commercial custom backgrounding yard or a wintering yard, as per that figure 1. So how much gain do you want to get on these stocker cattle? Well, the first thing we have to realize is it depends. About 50% of the folks who run or manage stocker cattle want somewhere between a little less than 2 pounds to a little bit more than 2 pounds per head per day. And that's a pretty aggressive gain. Just to let you know, once they get in a feed yard, they'll be gaining 3.5, 4 pounds a day. So this is not, we're not pushing these cattle too hard. And so we're going to look at figure 6.3 in just a second. So others, they may want to get better gain out of their cattle. Others may be happy with less gain out of their cattle. But kind of as a rule of thumb, is about 50% want about 1.75 pounds to 2.25 pounds per head per day gain on these cattle. If you've ever driven from Kingsville to Laredo or from Corpus to Laredo in kind of that cactus rock country out there, really any time of the year, but especially in the spring and the fall, not so much in the summer, and you get west of Frere, you've passed through Frere and you're headed to Laredo on Highway 359 or 59, 59. And you get out there, you'll see lots and lots and lots of stocker cattle in that what do we call South Texas brush country, where they can't grow much grass, but they got big pastures. They also have big hunting leases out there. Now those calves are not going to do this on that kind of country. They're going to grow about pound to 1.5 pounds per day because there's not that much forage out there, and they've got to hunt for that forage amongst the cactus and the prickly pear and the brush. And so what I'm trying to tell you is some want more gain, some want less gain, but a good rule of thumb is if we can get 1.75 pounds to 2.25 pounds on those calves, we're going to be happy. All right, so here's figure 6.3. So this is targeted gains in pounds per day. Okay, and this is percentage over here. So this is percentage of operations, and if you add up all these numbers that I've got arrows pointing to, you're going to get 100%. Now here are the categories. So less than 1.5 pounds, 1.5 pounds to 1.75 pounds, 1.75 to 2, 2 to 2.25, and more than 2.25. So here's my comment that most folks, about 50%, are going to expect those cattle to gain this. This would be a stocker operation, say northeast of Laredo, between Frere and Laredo. They're only going to gain about 1 pound to 1.25 pounds a day in that type of country. So this is just a survey of looking at targeted rates of gain from stocker operations all across the United States. Okay, just to let you know. So not very many expect them to gain really, really well because that's going to cost money, and some get by on pretty marginal country, but the most part, the two biggest percentages, 30% here and 27% here, are somewhere between 1.76 and 2.25 pounds per head per day. So they're gaining, don't get me wrong, they're gaining, they're growing, but we're not pushing them on a high grain ration. We're pushing them on forage or maybe a little hay to begin with. So how do these folks make money with stocker cattle? Well, The only way you can make money with stocker cattle is you got to have pretty cheap grass, and it's got to be readily available. Like this spring would not be a good time to run stocker cattle in South Texas per se, because it's been awful dry. So it's not so much the cost, it's going to be the availability. But it's kind of like supply and demand. When you got a lot of grass or forage, you know, the lease cost on these places are pretty cheap. Most stocker operations lease the country that they run their cattle on. And you can pay the owner of the land based on per head per day basis, or you can pay the owner based on per pound of gain, cost of gain. Okay? So not only do you have to have inexpensive and available grass or forage, you got to have relatively inexpensive calves, and they've got to be available. Okay? So you can run recently weaned calves, or you can buy maybe some short yearlings, some 10 to 12-month-old calves. But you know, you're all you're doing is buying and reselling later, and so the cost is pretty important when it comes to running stocker cattle. Here's the biggest factor right here: good health management of the calves. You got to make, you know, you're getting these calves from all different sources. You can't be guaranteed of the source and the age. And so you're probably buying them through the sale barn, or somebody's buying them for you through the sale barn. You don't know the history on these calves, and so you got to get them straightened out. You got to get them over any sickness, and you got to set up a really good vaccination program for them. Now, most of the times, like if somebody buys my calves, they won't know this, but my calves will be at least vaccinated one time. So essentially all they do is give a booster if they knew my calves, but they won't, because, you know, I only sell a few head at a time, and so they won't know anything about my calves. And so even though I vaccinated them with an initial vaccine, they're going to come right back behind them after they buy them. They're going to give them what they think is an initial and then a booster. So my calves probably get vaccinated 3 times in that first year. And then once you sell these calves, you got to be pretty close to a feed yard, within, let's say, 200 to 500 miles, because somebody's going to have to pay the shipping on those cattle. And so, you know, that's why the Texas Panhandle, they plant a lot of winter wheat up there northwest of Dallas, and it's a pretty short haul to any feed yard in the Texas Panhandle, or even western Kansas or eastern Colorado. So that's within, you know, 500 miles. So that's important. So where do we find most of our stocker cattle? Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma. Okay? So if you look at table 6.1, it actually takes up about a page and a half. And you can look at the different options across the country, and you can focus in on Texas. And so Texas is at the bottom of page 163, and we're considered the southern Great Plains. But you can see they run stockers in the northwest, they run stockers in the west, they run stockers in the southwest, they run stockers in the Great Plains, they run stockers in the Midwest, they run stockers in the Northeast, and they run stockers in the Southeast. So I at least want you to read the Texas portion so you can get an idea of what we do in Texas. It talks about summer grazing, it talks about light calves, it talks about heavy calves, and so please read what Texas stocker cattle look like. And if you want, you can kind of look at other parts of the country for comparison. But I really like table 6.1, so that's kind of a hint, especially you can see what happens. So what's wintering versus backgrounding? This is sometimes hard for students to understand. Wintering is springborn calves weaned in the fall, bought in the fall, straightened out in the fall. Let's get them through the winter. Let's get them through the winter so when the grass greens up in the spring, they'll be ready. So that's wintering. So if you're wintering a set of calves, you're going to get some slow gain on them based on a high roughage diet. So mostly hay. You're going to mostly feed them hay, maybe a little bit of grain. Okay? So the idea is to get them through their first winter, and then these calves will go to grass either spring or summer. In a backgrounding yard, which kind of is at least what happens to some of the calves of the King Ranch, they promote a little bit better gain to get them set up to go to the feed yard, and maybe not so much go into grass. So we want a little bit faster gain, which means greater gain. and they'll incorporate kind of roughage and some grain mixed in, and they'll put them on kind of a different ration, kind of setting them up to get ready for the feed yard. Bottom line is these calves will go to the feed yard sooner. So these backgrounding calves, they may have access to grass, they may have access to hay, that would be the roughage part, but they would also get a little grain every day. Okay? So where does this backgrounding take place? Well, it's about a 40-40-20 split. So about 40% of the calves normally are backgrounded at a ranch if they can get paid for doing it. In other words, if they've got buyers that appreciate that these calves have been backgrounded. About the same percentage, another 40% of our calves are backgrounded in a background yard, kind of like the pictures I showed you. And then 20% of the calves will be backgrounded at a feedlot. So they may come off of grass as a stocker calf, and they may go to a backgrounding yard for a month or two, which is adjacent to the feed yards. So if you ever drive to San Antonio, you go by a town called Edroy as you leave Corpus. So you leave Corpus, you leave 5 Points there at Cal Allen, you'll keep going to San Antonio, you go by a feed yard in Edroy, and if you look to the west or look to your left as you drive north, you'll see a little bitty feed yard in the town of Edroy that kind of looks like a small version of the feed yard I showed you. But if you look around the perimeter of that feed yard, you'll see some large grass pastures with cattle in them. So what happens is they get those cattle off of grass and they put them on a grass small pasture right next to the feed yard, and then they'll start feeding them a ration's got a little bit of grain in it, but they'll still have access to grass, so it'll transition them from grass onto grain. And you have to do that slowly because the microbes that digest grass are different than the microbes that digest grain. Remember, we have starch digesters and we have fiber digesters, and so the idea is to change that population of microbes in the rumen slowly, because if you put calves coming off of grass directly to a feed yard, they'll either bloat or they'll get lactic acidosis. So you have to kind of transition them or give them some background before they go into a feed yard. Okay? So over here in red, I have when are stocker, that should be a question, when are stocker calves purchased by buyers of stocker calves? Well, believe it or not, about 30% of the stocker calves in any one year are purchased in October. 15% are purchased in November, and 10% are purchased in September, because we're talking mostly about spring-born calves that are weaned in the fall. So we call this the fall peak. So if you sell your calves early, you'll probably get a better price than when you sell them in late October, because the markets will be full. We have a smaller version, which we call the spring peak, which happened starting back in March, and it's going to be this month and next month. And about 6% of the nation's calves are sold in March, April, and May. And then the rest of the calves are sold in the months that I don't have written down here. Okay, so all those numbers will not add up to 100%. So we have a fall run of calves. That's for most of the country that have spring-born calves, and that's September, October, November. But the bulk come in October. And then we have a little mini spring run from March to May. And it's about 6% of the total calves produced that in 1 year are sold in those 3 months. So that's kind of when you can expect the price to go down a little bit. So that's kind of important to know. So if you're selling, you want to sell early. If you're buying, you probably want to buy later, because the price will be cheaper, because those buyers get filled up and the price will go down because it's supply and demand. So hopefully that straightens out the difference between wintering and backgrounding. In a sense, they're kind of the same, and a lot of old timers call it just straightening out the calves, because these calves come from various sources. They got various health programs that they came from, and so you got to make sure they're all protected and they're all healthy before you turn them out, because the time to doctor them is when they're when you can close get access to them, not when they're in big pastures. And then finally, when do we see the fall run of stocker calves, and when do we see the spring run of stocker calves? That's September, October, November, and March, April, May. Very good, very good, very good. All right, so what do they feed these calves? So table 6.2 is feed sources or feed stuffs that are fed stocker calves. Okay, so we've got about 7 different, 6 different options. Okay, so again, this does not total 100%. This is a percent of enterprises. So let's start out with La Paloma Ranch in Rivera, Texas. They would be right here. They graze their stockers on warm season pastures. That's coastal Bermuda grass pastures. And if you drive between Rivera and Falfurrias and look south as you drive west, you will see those big, large traps that hold a lot of stocker calves. About 29% of stockers run them on cool season pastures. Well, what's a cool season pasture? That's going to be your winter annuals, such as wheat, oats, and ryegrass. So in North Texas, those spring-born, fall-weaned calves will go probably in November, December. They'll go out on winter wheat, and they'll stay there till March 15th. So when we're having spring break, that's a pretty important date, March 15th, for winter wheat cattle. If you're a wheat farmer in North Texas, you have to make a decision by March 15th whether you're going to harvest that wheat for grain, like for bread and tortillas and everything else, and on Wheaties. You have to make a decision because we don't want any poop to be picked up by the wheat combine. And so we grow winter wheat in South Texas. Between Tamuk and my house, there was a lot of wheat grown this winter, and it looked really good. No fence around it. That was 100% for grain purposes. But in North Texas, all you got to do is put up an electric fence, a hot wire around those wheat pastures, and you can throw cattle out on it. So what's magical about March 15th? Well, by March 15th, those wheat farmers have to tell USDA either yes or no, I'm going to harvest this for grain. So if they're going to harvest it for grain, they've got to get the cattle off on March 15th or by March 15th. That way the crop has about another month to grow before it sets its head and produces grain. And by that time the manure that's out there in the field should be partially decayed. If for some reason they didn't get enough moisture to produce a good wheat crop, and it comes by March 15th, the farmer, the owner of the wheat, may say, you know what, I'm not going to make a good crop this year, so I'm not going to harvest this for grain. I'm just going to let the guy or gal that runs the stocker calves, I'm just going to let him keep him on there until the wheat quits growing and gets too hot. Okay, so March 15th is a pretty important date if you got cattle on wheat pasture, because you got to be ready to take those cattle off and possibly sell them or put them on some different grass. And that happens every single year. You can see, by and large, for the most part, folks either use harvested forages, okay, like hay, or byproducts of harvested forages. So maybe corn stalks in the fall, after they harvest the corn, maybe there's corn stalks left over. You can put a hot wire around a field of corn, and those cattle can graze that. Okay? So cool season pastures and small grain pastures kind of get confusing because small grains are also wheat, oats, and rye. So kind of two different deals. Ryegrass, okay, is a cool season pasture, but it doesn't produce any grain. Whereas rye, that we make whiskey out of, it would be considered a small grain. So these are kind of similar, and it's hard to pull them apart, but you can see about 40% of the folks use cool season or small grain pastures, which grow from about November until, say, April. And so that gets them through the winter. And then here, stockpile forages and crop residues are kind of like this one. So I don't really like their categories, but they are what they are. And so harvested forages, that would be hay. That has to be hay. Okay? Then we got cool season pastures, warm season pastures like a La Paloma. And then you got wheat, oats, and rye, grain pasture. and then stockpiled forages or crop residues. So those are, you can tell there's not much. The most expensive part of all this would be the harvested forage. That would be the hay. Okay, but you can stock your cattle on hay and pasture as well. So I'm kind of talking in circles, I know, but just to let you know that we've got hays and byproducts from grain industries, maybe like distillers grains from the ethanol. We got cool season pastures, which I guess honestly would be ryegrass. Warm season pastures, which would be like coastal Bermuda grass or buffalo grass or Tifton 85, and then you got true small grains, which would be oats, wheat, and rye, and then you got old stockpiled forage from the fall, or say corn stalks, and then this other category. So kind of a little bit of everything over here. I understand that, a little bit of everything, but the main thing to remember is we got to put this gain on these cattle with something that doesn't cost us much money. Doesn't cost us much money. Okay, that's the goal. Put cheap gain on these cattle and get them ready for the feed yard. So again, how do you make money with stocker cattle? It gets back to something to feed them. Okay, and you got to figure out, what is your cost of gain going to be? What's it going to cost you to put a pound of gain on each one of these calves? Well, that's going to depend on their initial weight, what you buy them, at what weight you bought them, and do they have the genetics? Do they have the genetics to gain weight? That's also important. And we'll come back to this on part 2. Okay? So let's say we bought big calves. They weigh more than 500 pounds, and they've got a moderate to heavy muscle, so they'd be number 1s and number 2s. Moderate to heavy muscles, number 1s and number 2 muscle score. We could background them dudes for just a very short period of time, and they can go right to a feed yard and they'll do really, really well. They can do really, really well. If we buy lighter calves that don't have quite the genetics for heavy muscle, and so they're going to be low to moderate gaining animals potentially, we might want to own them for a little bit longer. We might want to let them mature a little bit more and get a little older, and so probably those calves coming out of, say, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, those are the kind of calves that are going to go right to winter wheat. So they're going to be springborn, and they're going to be ready to hit the winter wheat about December, and they'll stay there till what date is it? March 15th, and then where will they go after that? Summer grass. And then the following fall, so their first fall, they're being marketed. They winter on wheat, they summer on grass, and their second fall, okay, so they're approaching 22, 23 months of age, they're going to go into the feed yard, and they're going to stay there for about 6 months. As long as we can get them out of that feed yard before they're 30 months of age, we'll be doing good. Okay? So, when we talk about initial weight, you got heavier calves. They tend to go to a background yard, then to the feed yard. This background yard could have some grass associated with it. Lighter weight calves that aren't going to gain as well, they're probably going to go to winter wheat for a slow gain, and then they'll go to summer grass for another slow gain, and then they go to the feed yard. So, kind of complicated where you fit in this scenario. Okay? So, let's use our own La Paloma ranch here south of Kingsville. They tend to buy lighter weight calves with some Brahman influence, and they're going to be mostly number 2s, and they're going to buy them, and they're going to go to summer grass first, and then they're going to go to winter wheat. So there's no hard and fast rule here. So La Paloma Ranch between Rivera and Fowl, they buy lightweight calves, but they tend to put them on summer grass first. And after they leave La Paloma, they tend to go to Uvalde, and they'll graze under center pivots. Kind of in the winter, they'll graze crop residue and maybe some winter wheat under center pivots in Uvalde, and after that they go to the Flint Hills of Kansas, you know where that's at, and then they go to the feed yard. So those calves kind of have kind of a different route they take when they start out here at La Paloma. They go to summer grass first, then they'll winter them, and then they take them in the spring and put them on the Flint Hills, and they hit the feed yard about May. So once again, there's no hard and fast rule, but in general, heavy calves are going to be stockered shorter period of time, and lighter weight calves with less potential for a good gain, they're going to be stockered longer. So it's a very flexible program, and it kind of depends on what kind of forage you have access to and what is the cost of your gain going to be. Okay, so you don't want to put a lot of money in these cattle. That's my point. You want to buy them as cheap as you can, put on that cheap gain, and sell them heavier. That's the goal of a stock